What if Canada decided to strike back in the trade war, not with steel, autos, or lumber, but with something far more dangerous to Donald Trump's political survival? Eggs and poultry. For years, dairy products have been the classic flashpoint between Ottawa and Washington, a sector where Canada's supply management system, with its tight quotas and sky-high over-quota tariffs, has blocked American producers and repeatedly triggered Trump's anger. If dairy can spark presidential outbursts and trade threats, imagine what would happen if Canada applied the same pressure to U.S. eggs and poultry, a sector even more politically explosive for Trump. This is the weapon almost nobody talks about, except the people who matter most to Trump: farmers, processors, and rural voters across the U.S. Farm Belt. If Ottawa ever turned its supply-managed egg and poultry system into a trade counterstrike, the impact on the United States would be immediate, deeply political, and impossible for Trump to ignore, because in the U.S., eggs aren't just food, they're votes.
The world has become more dangerous and divided. Many of our former strengths, based on our close ties to America, have become our vulnerabilities.
To understand the stakes, we need to zoom out and look at the political map of 2025. Trump is deep into his second term, leaning heavily on tariffs as his go-to negotiating tactic. Canada, under Prime Minister Mark Carney, has avoided retaliation so far, choosing diplomacy while expanding trade ties with Asia. But behind that calm exterior, Ottawa still holds unusually sharp leverage thanks to its supply management regime, a system that controls production, restricts imports, and legally shields entire sectors through quotas and high over-quota tariffs.
It means that our economic strategy needs to change dramatically and rapidly. Above all, we will build Canadian. We'll be our own best customer.
We have a supply managed system in Canada, which is just as the name suggests, it's managing supply. We introduced it in 1972, and it's Canadian production for Canadian consumers.
Eggs and poultry sit inside that framework, just like dairy. And this is where the what-if becomes explosive. The U.S. poultry and egg industries are not just economic pillars, they are political fortresses. Their geography overlaps almost perfectly with Trump's electoral base. Iowa, Georgia, Arkansas, Missouri, Ohio, Pennsylvania. These are not just farm states, they are the backbone of Trump's coalition. That's why agricultural retaliation has always been Washington's nightmare. When China targeted soybeans during the 2018-2019 trade war, the shock almost derailed Trump's standing in the Midwest. If that was the impact when the adversary was Beijing, imagine the pressure if Canada, a friendly neighbor, disrupted access instead. The economic scale alone makes the hypothetical serious. The United States produces roughly $57 to $60 billion worth of poultry and egg products every year. A significant portion of that output depends on stable export markets to prevent domestic oversupply. And Canada, because of proximity and reliability, consistently ranks among the top buyers of American processed eggs, yolks, and chicken cuts. So if Ottawa ever slowed licensing, recalibrated quotas, tightened inspection windows, or simply shifted allocations toward non-U.S. suppliers, all fully legal under WTO rules, American producers would feel the consequences almost immediately. Supplies would back up, prices could soften. Rural counties might start questioning why the White House provoked a response it wasn't prepared to handle. This is why the scenario matters. Eggs and poultry are Trump's blind spot. They touch not just the farm economy, but the electoral core he counts on. Canada wouldn't need dramatic action. Its supply management structure already offers subtle but powerful tools. Imports are capped by quota, and anything above that threshold faces steep, often prohibitive tariffs. Ottawa administers these quotas with considerable discretion, adjusting timing, pacing, sanitary reviews, or allocation priorities. Even modest changes could shape real-world outcomes. A slight slowdown in licensing during peak U.S. production could create bottlenecks. A shift in quota allocation could favor European or Asian suppliers. An additional inspection requirement could delay shipments just long enough to unsettle markets. All of this would be legal, incremental, and fully consistent with the way Canada has historically defended dairy access during past U.S.-Canada disputes. For Trump, the political cost would be immediate. Governors in poultry-heavy states could accuse Washington of mismanaging trade. Farm associations, among Trump's most loyal supporters, would demand clarity. And rural voters, who already faced price shocks and disease-related disruptions in recent years, might see any loss of export access as needless turmoil triggered by Washington's tariffs.
Trump might ignore retaliation in sectors like lumber or aluminum, but he cannot ignore agriculture, because agriculture is his political oxygen. Every rural rally he holds reinforces the message that he is the defender of American farmers. If Canada were ever to tighten poultry and egg access, even symbolically, it would immediately test that narrative. America's domestic food economy is fragile. Inflation remains a central complaint among voters. A shakeup in poultry and egg markets could raise prices for consumers, even as farmers face falling export income, the worst possible combination for any president. Meanwhile, media in the U.S. would amplify the story. Did the tariff war backfire? Why is Canada hitting American farmers? Is Trump risking his base? The political pressure would be intense long before any formal trade action escalated.
While the exact figures would depend on the severity of Canada's action, existing agricultural data allows for a realistic estimate. USDA numbers indicate that Canada buys roughly $700 to $900 million USD worth of American poultry, eggs, and processed egg products annually, across all related HS categories. If Ottawa reduced access by as little as 15 to 20% through slower licensing, preference shifts, or added sanitary reviews, U.S. producers could hypothetically lose around $100 to $180 million per year in direct export revenue. Because the sector runs on tight margins, the knock-on effects could push total losses into the $250 to $300 million range once oversupply, domestic price drops, and inventory write-downs are factored in. Those numbers are small relative to the U.S. economy as a whole, but massive inside the rural counties that determine American elections. And that is where the real danger lies for Trump.
For Canada, the fallout of such a hypothetical response would be limited. The country is largely self-sufficient in eggs and poultry, and domestic producers would quickly fill any gap. Consumers might see minor fluctuations, but the overall system would remain stable. The greater risk would be political, the possibility of provoking Washington into reopening agricultural chapters of USMCA, but that risk already exists under Trump's escalating tariff strategy. And that brings us to the heart of the matter. In trade conflicts, the most powerful weapons are often the quietest ones. Eggs and poultry may seem unremarkable, but they underpin the politics of rural America. If Canada ever chose to use this leverage, the hypothetical fallout in the U.S. Farm Belt could be significant. Shaken prices, anxious producers, pressure from governors, and a wave of criticism from the very voters Trump depends on. For now, this remains only a scenario, not a prediction, but a warning. Because in the US-Canada trade standoff, the next decisive move may not come from factories or forests, but from something far smaller and far more politically explosive, the humble egg.
Today, another terrible tragedy. As they laugh, 1,200 workers at the Ingersoll Cami plant learned that they would lose their jobs after that Prime Minister promised he would negotiate a win and that he would keep their jobs here in Canada.
I'll tell you how the Prime Minister how he will deal with the auto sector. He will look at the auto workers in the eyes and he will say, "We will fight for your job."
Across Ontario, the sound of silence has replaced the rhythm of machines. At General Motors' Cami plant in Ingersoll, more than 1,200 workers learned their electric van line would shut down, just days after Stellantis moved its Jeep Compass production from Brampton to Illinois. Together, those decisions erased over 4,000 Canadian jobs in less than 2 weeks. What had long been the heartbeat of Canada's industrial identity now feels like a symbol of loss and uncertainty. That shock quickly spilled into Parliament. The chamber turned into a political crossfire as opposition leader Pierre Poilievre accused the government of betraying workers and wasting billions in subsidies that failed to protect Canadian jobs. His words echoed the frustration felt in auto towns across the province. But Industry Minister Melanie Joly rose to answer, calm yet defiant, promising that Ottawa was already meeting with GM's leadership, Unifor representatives, and Ontario Premier Doug Ford to form a national response group. Her vow was simple: Canada will fight for these jobs. That exchange captured more than politics. It was a snapshot of a country wrestling with its industrial pride, the belief that Canadian workers could compete and thrive in a continental system that once felt unbreakable. Yet now, with assembly lines going dark, Canadians are asking a painful question: who still controls the future of North America's auto industry, and how much of it still belongs to Canada?
We're negotiating back in Washington, but also, this is important to say that I met this morning with the Canadian CEO of GM. I was in conversation with the head of the labor union of Unifor, and I also talked to Doug Ford, and I talked to Vic Fideli. And you know what? We're putting in place a response group. We will make sure that we fight for these jobs.
The parliamentary clash centered squarely on General Motors and the shock at Ingersoll. Opposition leader Pierre Poilievre pressed the government on why more than 1,200 GM workers were being left without a line to build, accusing Ottawa of failing to shield families whose paychecks depended on the Kami plant. He framed the moment as proof that the government's support for the auto sector had not translated into concrete protection for Ingersoll. Industry Minister Melanie Joly kept the focus on GM. She outlined back-to-back calls with the company's Canadian leadership, coordination with Unifor, and direct talks with Ontario's Premier and economic ministers. The immediate objective, she said, was practical and urgent: secure a replacement model for Kami so that Ingersoll keeps its skilled workforce employed rather than losing it to attrition. Only after anchoring the debate in GM did the conversation widen. Stellantis surfaced as context, a reminder that the Brampton hit had come just days earlier and deepened the sense of vulnerability across Ontario's auto belt. Poilievre pointed to the multi-billion-dollar support for Stellantis as evidence that generous deals did not guarantee Canadian jobs. Joly countered by stressing enforcement and accountability while steering the chamber back to the task at hand, stabilizing GM's footprint and preventing further job erosion at Kami. By the end of the exchange, the lines were clear. The opposition demanded answers for the immediate loss at GM. The government presented a plan centered on Ingersoll: engage the company, mobilize the province, work with labor, and land a new model. For workers, the message mattered less than the outcome. What they needed was not another headline, but a path that keeps the lights on inside Kami and preserves the skills that built Ontario's reputation in the first place.
At first glance, Trump's auto push looked like a victory for his America First promise. Automakers announced investments worth billions across Illinois, Michigan, and Indiana. Stellantis alone committed $13 billion and 5,000 new American jobs. The headlines were exactly what the White House wanted: factories returning home, a rebirth of U.S. manufacturing power. But behind those headlines, a different story was unfolding. North America's auto network had been built over decades of cross-border integration. Engines made in Ontario traveled to Michigan for assembly, then returned to Canada for final finishing. When that system was broken, efficiency crumbled. Suppliers faced shipping delays and shortages of critical parts. Labor costs in U.S. plants surged as companies scrambled to fill gaps left by disrupted Canadian production. Analysts from Reuters and Bloomberg note that what looked like a manufacturing revival has instead become a patchwork of inefficiencies. Investment has not translated into productivity. Relocation costs and logistics bottlenecks have erased much of the benefit of reshoring. Even American plants now depend on Canadian suppliers that are scaling back, leaving the entire ecosystem strained. In Canada, the shock runs deep. Entire communities in Brampton, Ingersoll, and Oshawa feel the impact, not only in lost paychecks, but in the erosion of confidence that Canada can still build its own future. Economists say the region is not experiencing a renaissance of industry, but a redistribution of risk. Trump may have won a headline, but he lost an ecosystem.
Our goal is to bring back a new model to Ingersoll, and we're on it. Thank you.
In Ottawa, the Carney government has begun crafting what is now called the Team Canada Industrial Plan, a national strategy to protect manufacturing capacity and rebuild industrial confidence. The plan brings together federal and provincial leaders, labor unions, and private investors under a single mission: to keep Canada's productive core intact. Its first goal is to secure new production for the Ingersoll plant, keeping high-skilled jobs in Ontario. At the same time, Ottawa is pushing forward with battery manufacturing projects, critical minerals development, and industrial partnerships with the EU, Japan, and South Korea, countries that have recently inked trade deals with Washington. Canada wants to make sure those same markets stay open to Canadian exports, even as Trump reshapes the continent's trade map. At home, the plan represents a return to industrial activism, the belief that manufacturing is a pillar of national security. Prime Minister Mark Carney has described it as re-anchoring Canada's productive capacity. Ontario and Quebec premiers have pledged to join the effort. Doug Ford promised provincial incentives to keep auto assembly on Canadian soil, while Unifor has begun retraining programs for displaced workers in the EV sector. Economists from the Conference Board of Canada estimate that with coordinated policy support, Canada could recover half its lost auto jobs within 3 years. But beyond the numbers, a new tone is emerging. In Parliament, Jolie ended her speech with a pledge that resonated across the country. Canada will not stand by while foreign decisions erase its industrial future. In Brampton and Ingersoll, that message is becoming a rallying cry. Workers are organizing, communities are raising funds, and a grassroots slogan has taken hold: "Keep it Canadian." The contrast with Washington could not be sharper. Trump celebrates his short-term victories, but his policies have sparked a wave of unity north of the border. Canada is not retreating, it is reorganizing. Trump may build walls, but Canada is building something stronger: resilience. This fight is no longer about cars alone, it is about who defines North America's industrial future: a United States acting alone, or a Canada determined to stand on its own feet. And for the families in Ingersoll and Brampton watching their assembly lines go dark, that determination means everything. Because in the battle for jobs and dignity, Canada's industrial heart is still very much alive.